Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's luncheon seminar. Today we've had three that have been exciting, illuminating, not always happy, but illuminating. And we're going to hear more of things that we need to know about, don't know about, and don't know enough about, and it's important that we do. And so we have here with us today Trudy Rubin from the Philadelphia Inquirer, the world affairs correspondent who knows everything about all the most troubling places that we can think about in the news. She's been there, she's going back. Today it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, and there are lots of things we ought to learn about that. So let me just introduce one of our nation's most distinguished foreign correspondents, Trudy Rubin.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, and this seems like a wonderful program. This is my first trip ever to Scranton, so I feel like I'm discovering something new, and obviously my first trip to the university, since never was in the city. I've been covering armpits of the universe for many, many years. I mean, some of them are delightful places. They just have big problems. For the Christian Science Monitor as Middle East correspondent for several years, based in Jerusalem and Beirut. And I've been at the Inquirer for quite a long time, and I now write a twice-weekly foreign affairs column that runs in a lot of other papers. And I have spent a lot of time from the fall of Saddam to last December visiting Iraq and writing about that problem. But I must say that getting immersed in the Afghanistan-Pakistan issue outdoes anything I have devoted myself to in all these years, including many years of covering the Israeli-Palestinian problem, Chechnya, Georgia, Eastern Europe in the late 80s and early 90s, 20 years since the fall of the wall. I was there during that time. But nothing is as complex, as daunting, and really, to me, as scary as this Afghanistan-Pakistan issue has become, for many reasons that I will touch on. I was last there in April and May. I came to Pakistan at a very fraught moment. When I arrived in Pakistan in April, the government was still involved in a deal it had made with one of the Pakistani Taliban groups and touting this as sort of peace in our time, a deal that was made with a religious figure known as Sufi Muhammad, whose son-in-law was a Taliban leader, a big Taliban leader named Maulana Fazlallah. The deal with Sufi Muhammad was made in the Swat Valley. Most of you have probably heard of that. And when I arrived in Islamabad, there were speeches being made in Parliament about how this was such a great deal, and almost nobody was questioning the signing of this deal, even though the Pakistani government had signed previous deals with Taliban leaders in North and South Waziristan, and they had always been broken. By the time I left, well, let's say after I had been there about 5 days, the Titanic slowly started turning away from the iceberg. What happened was that Mr. Sufi Muhammad gave a speech after the deal was finalized in which he basically said that the Pakistani Parliament and Supreme Court were un-Islamic, which basically means that the members could be killed. in jihadi language, and said also that there was no need for the Taliban and SWAT to pay any attention to these government institutions or the Constitution. And at the same time, the Taliban group headed by his son-in-law started moving out of the Swat Valley and moving towards the capital, Islamabad, and actually took a couple of towns that were only about 60 miles away from the capital. And I watched, and it was fascinating, how reluctantly Parliament members started changing their language. Needless to say, there were a lot of calls from Washington to the Pakistani president, Asif Zardari, and to the head of the military, General Kayani. But it really took several days before they finally admitted to the obvious, which is that the Taliban hadn't even kept the deal for 24 hours after the ink was dry, and that Islamabad, the capital of Pakistan, which has dozens of nuclear weapons, was under threat from the Taliban. Since that day, the Pakistani army, in principle, has been against certain Taliban groups. And you probably have read in the newspapers that the Pakistani army is about to launch an offensive in South Waziristan, a tribal area, not exactly on the border of Afghanistan, but part of a collection of tribal areas that do border on Afghanistan. But the Pakistani army is still playing a double game, and I will get back to that in a moment. But that trip showed me how conflicted internally the Pakistanis are about fighting these jihadis, doing so only when they are left no choice. And I'll get back to that also as to why, but it certainly complicates the choices that President Obama has to make. Let me move over to Afghanistan, and let me start with the question that I think is central to this whole problem, which is, what is the threat? This is the question that President Obama is wrestling with, and this is the question that has to be addressed before we can decide what we should or should not be doing in that country, and how Afghanistan relates to Pakistan, where there is al-Qaeda. And before I say another thing, I want to get my water glass. As you are all aware, the President is conducting a review of what our strategy should be towards Afghanistan and Pakistan. And there now is an acronym, thank you, AFPAC, that is used to shorten the lingo. The President already did one strategic review when he came into office. All kinds of papers were prepared by the military and civilians, and that strategic review was concluded in March and was put together in a white paper. And at that point, the President seemed committed to what is known in the military trade as a counterinsurgency strategy. Counterinsurgency strategy is broader than a counterterrorist strategy. What's the difference between the two? A counterterrorist strategy involves basically simply trying to go after terrorist groups themselves, the actual players, whether with missiles, with special forces, with unmanned drones, or in whatever way possible. A counterinsurgency strategy is broader. It aims to enable the population to turn against the insurgents, the premise being that they can be turned or that they don't like the insurgents, and to create a situation where the host country, which is being attacked by insurgents, can itself train up its military, strengthen its own government, and take over the fight, and then the United States can withdraw. Counterinsurgency strategy is something that was abandoned by the U.S. military after the Vietnam War. It was considered in bad odor. We had tried it there and failed. Some in the military will argue that by the time we really understood counterinsurgency theory in Vietnam, public opinion had turned against the very idea that it might have succeeded. I won't even get into that argument, but the fact is that it was literally dropped from the books after Vietnam. In Iraq, where I spent a lot of time, in the first years we were in Iraq, we did not try counterinsurgency theory. We basically were trying to go after the bad guys, Al-Qaeda. We were failing miserably. Iraq had deteriorated into a civil war. And then General Petraeus hit the scene. He was a devotee of counterinsurgency. He had done his PhD thesis at Princeton on the lessons of Vietnam. And when Petraeus came into Iraq, and this all relates back to Afghanistan now, when Petraeus came into, did I say Vietnam? When Petraeus came into Iraq, he, with the 101st Airborne, went up to Mosul in the north, which was a hotbed of Al-Qaeda and Arab militants who came across the border from Syria. And he came in with a full-blown counterinsurgency strategy. The idea was, you give people jobs so they don't need to join up with the insurgents for cash, because there was no work to be had. You make contact with all the local leaders to make it clear that you don't intend to stay forever and you want to work with them. You train up local security forces so they can take over the job, and you try to strengthen the local government. It worked in Mosul, but Petraeus left too soon. When he left, the number of U.S. troops were cut by 2/3, and the insurgents just came back. It just had not been in place long enough. But Petraeus believed in this theory. He came back to Iraq, as you know, in desperation. Bush signed on to Petraeus's ideas. And at the end of '06, I watched as this counterinsurgency theory played out on the ground. And the reason why the Iraq case is relevant is because obviously Petraeus and McChrystal, who worked with him in Iraq, are affected by what they did and what they saw in Iraq. So it's important to know whether there really is any relevant comparison. What they did in Iraq was very much affected by the special circumstances of Iraq, which are different from Afghanistan, but there are some similarities. They came into a situation where you had Al-Qaeda, you had jihadi militants in Iraq, and you also had a civil war going on that was fueled deliberately by the jihadis, because it was in their interest to have Sunnis and Shia fighting each other, which would take down any central government and allow the jihadis to strengthen their position. However, by the time Petraeus came in, you did have tribal groups who were unhappy with the situation, Sunni tribal groups. They had been supporting Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda was so vicious that these Sunnis were getting tired of Al-Qaeda, and they were also losing their battle with Shiite militias. So the Sunni tribal leaders were ready to turn. And I believe that if Petraeus hadn't come in and helped them, they wouldn't have turned. They were tentatively ready, but not fully ready, because they were getting picked off when they tried to turn against Al-Qaeda. Petraeus came in, he gave them backup, he gave them air support. They didn't need guns, they had guns. He gave them money so they could hire their fellow tribesmen. They turned on Al-Qaeda, and they drove them out of the tribal areas in Anbar province, around Baghdad, and in Baghdad itself. So, and let me add here that counterinsurgency theory says you're trying to help government get going, you're trying to help government set up security services, and you're trying to train up local security services. The idea is that you don't stay forever. You clear an area, you train the locals to hold it, and you give money to help build it back up. Now, when Petraeus went in, the central government in Baghdad was the pits. It was not functional. However, Petraeus focused on the regions, on local leaders, and built them up to a point where finally things shifted because security improved. It became clearer that al-Qaeda was on the run. And at that point, the central government, meaning Prime Minister Maliki, finally got his nerve and started acting like a leader. Still corruption, still inefficient, but there now really is a central government that people look to for some things. Okay. Switch to Afghanistan. General McChrystal, as you probably have read, was asked to produce another strategy document. Why is the question. President Obama already had a strategy that he'd put together with his advisors in March. That strategy was based on the same theory that Petraeus used in Iraq. The idea was that the U.S. would work harder to train Afghan security forces, would put in enough U.S. forces to try to improve the security situation on the ground and protect local villagers and towns, and help those leaders, tribal leaders, elders, local politicians, turn against the Taliban, back them up, bring in Afghan forces, provide money for jobs, and then we would be able to pull back. That was the strategy then. What happened in the interim is that Obama pulled out the previous general, who just wasn't seen as tough enough, and that was concurred in by Petraeus and Secretary of Defense Gates. So you had a hiatus, you had a gap there. A new general came in, McChrystal, and he had to get his feet on the ground and do a new assessment, and time was lost. And in that lost time, the Taliban kept making gains on the ground. The Taliban kept making gains on the ground in Afghanistan basically because people were either intimidated or fed up. This is not Vietnam, where the Taliban are the heroes of the nationalist struggle. Most Afghans, and polls consistently show this, and I think they're reliable enough so that even if they're off somewhat, they do reflect public opinion. Most Afghans had no desire to see the Taliban come back. Their rule was vicious. And while Afghans in rural areas are religious, they are not religious necessarily in the way of the Taliban, nor were they looking for the foreign Arab fighters who work with the Taliban. However, the central government in Iraq in all these years has not provided services, has not provided jobs. The U.S., which came into a favorable situation after overthrowing the Taliban, the Bush administration's focus was totally on Iraq, and so almost all resources were pulled out of Afghanistan at a time when a small amount of aid might have made a huge difference, and when we had enormous leverage over President Karzai and could have done development projects because security was fine and the Taliban were in disarray. Instead, basically, we ignored Afghanistan for all of these years, basically until 2007, and the Taliban was able to stage an incredible comeback. They had crossed the border, their leadership into Pakistan, and I'll get back to Pakistan. They were able to regroup. They were able to come back and make progress in the tribal areas for several reasons. One, by sheer intimidation, threat, and murder. Second, because the government just hasn't reinstituted any basic services, including any semblance of law and order. So if people have property disputes, if they have land disputes, there's no one to go to. And third, there's no jobs. And the Taliban capitalized on all of that. They have an unlimited funding supply. It does not just come from the drugs, the poppy that's grown in the south of Afghanistan. It also comes from contributions from wealthy religious hardliners in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, not from those governments, but from people who live there. And so the Taliban was able to reconstitute during this time. And in the gap period, when McChrystal was just getting started, they made a big push. Obviously, they wanted to influence what would be done. In addition, you had elections. And these elections, which took place in August, as you know, were inconclusive. And so you have a situation right this week where it appears that an independent election commission of UN and international observers has concluded that the fraud in the elections was so extensive that President Karzai did not get the 50% plus one that he needs to avoid a runoff, and that technically the Constitution requires a runoff. So you have a situation with a weak central government, corrupt, not Karzai himself, but the symbol of corruption in Afghanistan is his brother, Ahmad Wali Karzai, who is the head of the provincial council in Kandahar province in the south, which borders Pakistan, and which is the place where the Taliban started. It's where Mullah Omar came from. He is now across the border in Pakistan, but the Taliban is gaining an increasing hold over the south in Kandahar and the province next door, Helmand. They are the center of drug production, and Ahmad Wali Karzai is one of the biggest drug lords and has put local officials in place who are part of the drug mafia. So you have a corrupt leadership in Kabul. You have a growing strength of the Taliban. And I think what happened is that, you know, President Obama's political aides looked at this and they said, this is a loser. Maybe we need to reassess strategy. And I think there was a great reluctance to get involved with sending more troops until at least health care was passed, a fear that Obama could lose his entire domestic agenda by expanding what was already becoming in this country a highly unpopular war with an uncertain outcome, and especially unpopular among Obama's own Democratic Party members. Now, General McChrystal is caught in the middle of this. He was asked to come up with a proposal for implementing the strategy that had already been agreed on in March, this counterinsurgency strategy. So he came up with this proposal. It's very interesting reading. You can get it online because it was leaked. I mean, the classified parts were not leaked, but the 62 pages, I have it in my briefcase here, and it's actually quite interesting. And actually, I meant to pull it out here because there was something I wanted to read. Just a second, if I can find it. And all this flop. But McChrystal was caught in a bind because his proposal was leaked, but the Obama administration didn't want to make a decision at this time. And basically what McChrystal said was this. He said, if the Afghan government falls to the Taliban, Afghanistan could again become a base for terrorism with obvious implications for regional stability. And let me mention here that the biggest threat that I see when I say what is the threat is less that the Taliban in the foreseeable is going to send something from over there to over here, although they may train people who come over here, like the Afghan young man who was arrested in the United States recently. But the biggest threat that I see is the blowback from an Afghan ascendancy a Taliban ascendancy in Afghanistan, the threat to Pakistan, because there will be a tremendous effect on what is a nuclear-armed state. The Taliban have made clear that they want to take over that state. And mind you, the Taliban are an agglomeration. I think of them like, this is a horrible analogy, but if someone has breast cancer and lymph nodes start developing cancer, and I had a dear friend where so many lymph nodes separately became cancerous that they glommed together in a ball under her arm. Well, she's still living 19 years on, although it was stage 3. But this is how I see it. It's like stage 3 cancer when the different Taliban groups start glomming together, linked with al-Qaeda. And I think that is what has happened in Afghanistan and Pakistan. You have the Afghan Taliban, but they are linked with al-Qaeda. And then you have Pakistani Taliban with their own aims, but some of them fight in Afghanistan. They want to take over the government of Pakistan, the Pakistani Taliban do, and they want to start a war with nuclear-armed India. And all these groups are now interconnected. And that, to me, is the biggest threat, because if the Afghan Taliban really take control of substantial areas of the country, which they're beginning to do, they will provide a hinterland for the Pakistani Taliban. And then if the Pakistani Taliban get hit by their own military, they'll move into Afghanistan and then move back into Pakistan, and back and forth across the border it goes. And that, to me, is the threat, because it's not a static group. It's a group that spreads like a cancer, and when they make headway in Afghanistan, they will also make more headway in Central Asia, and you will have more Muslims from outside, jihadis, flowing in. So I'm going to get back to this threat in a second, but just to finish up with General McChrystal. General McChrystal put out a strategy in which he said, basically wanting to do similar to what Petraeus did in Iraq in different circumstances. Train up the Afghan military faster, try to protect Afghans in regions and in provinces locally so that they might have the courage to turn against the Taliban, their own Taliban, and fight back. Meanwhile, you're training the Afghans to try to do the job with the Americans at first, then on their own. And in the meantime, try to assist the Afghan government in providing jobs and improving agriculture. And if you can't deal with the central government because it's too corrupt, try to deal with the government in the provinces, which is what they did in Iraq. He came out with this strategy, but the timing was inopportune because, as I said, the Obama administration, with so much on its plate, was getting cold feet. And Vice President Biden has been arguing that we should revert to a counterterrorism strategy in which we basically go after al-Qaeda. And al-Qaeda, as he and his staff point out, is mainly in Pakistan. The al-Qaeda leadership is hiding along the border and is believed to be in the Pakistani tribal areas along the border. And General James Jones, the National Security Advisor, has said publicly that U.S. intelligence believes there's less than 100 al-Qaeda members in Afghanistan. So then we come back to this question of the threat. If al-Qaeda is in Pakistan, does that mean that we really would be better off simply pursuing al-Qaeda and either maintaining the status quo in Afghanistan or pulling back? Well, the problem with a counter-terrorist strategy is this. What we have been doing to pursue al-Qaeda in Pakistan, we've been firing Predator missiles from across the border in Afghanistan into those tribal areas. And secretly, we've also been firing them, some of them, from inside Pakistan, although the Pakistani government denies it. The reason we have been able to have some success in hitting al-Qaeda leaders is because we have intelligence on the ground. On the ground in Afghanistan, because we have U.S. forces. we have a lot of intelligence on the ground and a lot of infrastructure to fire those predators. On the Pakistani side, we are not allowed to send U.S. troops. However, the Pakistani military, which has finally gotten somewhat nervous about the Taliban and al-Qaeda, is cooperating to a certain extent on the ground with intelligence and allowing us to use our overhead assets. And there are probably a handful of special forces, U.S., inside, which the Pakistani government would never admit. If we pulled back from Afghanistan, we would lose a lot of those assets. We would not have the infrastructure on the ground. We would not have the ability to fire predators from the Afghan side. And also, if the Pakistani military believes that we are on our way out of Afghanistan, they will change their whole position, I believe, and most experts that I respect believe, towards helping us. The Pakistani military, as I said, is playing a double game. On the one hand, they are now fighting some elements of their own Taliban because those elements have turned on the Pakistani military, so they have to fight them. They've been left no choice. That's the good news. But the bad news is this, that the Pakistani military still to this day thinks its main threat and enemy is India. It is obsessed with India. When you talk with Pakistani officers, they go ballistic if you intimate or say out loud that the real threat to their country might be from the Islamic militants within. They will insist that the threat is still India, and the bulk of their troops are still on the border with India. Moreover, in the past, Pakistani intelligence and military have cooperated in training militant groups whose purpose was to fight India, especially in the disputed territory of Kashmir, which is divided between India and Pakistan. Some of those groups have become total Frankensteins, most of them have, and in fact, groups that were trained by the Pakistani military and intelligence are now conducting terrorist attacks inside India, including the outrage in Mumbai. Now, you remember when there were a handful of suicide killers in Mumbai. They shut down a whole city. They killed 167 people. They came by boat from Karachi. I had the chance to interview the Pakistani Army Commander-in-Chief, General Kayani, and I said to him, "You trained these guys. Did you send them?" And he said to me, not exactly in these words, but, we're not crazy. We did not send them. We don't want a war with India. Because in a war with India, Pakistan would be decimated. India has a bigger land army. The only thing that Pakistan has that could stop India is a nuclear bomb. And if Pakistan used that, you can imagine the consequences. So this is a tremendously fragile and dangerous situation. The Pakistani military is reluctant to crack down on many of these jihadi groups because it still sees them as cards against India, yet it has lost control of these groups. And these groups are now in cahoots with Afghan Taliban, with al-Qaeda. There are links tying them all together. And yet the Pakistani military cannot make up its mind to take a clear side. And I believe that if we were to really indicate we were moving our troops back, the following would happen. I'll back up and just tell you one other thing that General Kayani said to me. I asked him, why aren't you cracking down on the Afghan Taliban who were based inside Pakistan, like Mullah Omar, the leader of the Afghan Taliban? And again, not in so many words, but basically what he said to me is, we don't think you Americans know what you're doing in Afghanistan, and we think you'll be leaving. And so we're not going to give up this card. And the reason they see the Afghan Taliban as a card, they also trained the Afghan Taliban, is because they want a government in Kabul that is pro-Pakistani anti-Pakistan and anti-India. Right now, the government of Hamid Karzai, they despise. And they despise Hamid Karzai because he was educated in India, even though he's a Pashtun, the majority Sunni grouping, which has a huge number of Pashtuns who across the border who are Pakistani. Even though he's a Pashtun, he's seen as too friendly to India. He's seen as not friendly enough to Pakistan and not trustworthy. And the Pakistani military would like to replace him with somebody that they think they can control, and they still think that they could control the Afghan Taliban. Now, I think this is nuts because if you look at history, when the Taliban came into power in the mid-90s, and I've probably talked much too long, so I'll bring this to a close. When the Taliban came into power in the mid-90s, they were very close to Pakistan, and yet they hosted al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. And when the U.S. said clearly, if you don't give up bin Laden, we are going to attack you, they would not give up bin Laden. And so the Pakistanis are crazy to think that if they helped a Taliban government take over in Kabul, they could control it. And yet, I believe if we started pulling out, that's what would happen. So just to sum up, the bind, and I think it's a tremendously difficult and unpredictable situation that Obama faces. The bind that he faces is this: if he goes the Biden route for a counterterrorism strategy and we pull back, I think we will be tremendously hampered in our ability to go after the Taliban. After all, this is what we tried in the 90s, doing it from offshore with predators, with no intelligence on the ground, and we never had any success. At the same time, I think that we will precipitate a surge of Taliban strength. I think the Pakistanis will back Taliban leaders to take over in Kabul. And I think that will blow back on these foolish military leaders and military commanders in Pakistan. The weak civilian government in Pakistan does not want to go this route, but they're too weak to control the military, I fear. And I think you will wind up with a situation where Taliban of various groups, and some Pakistani, some Afghan, linked with al-Qaeda, control a huge part of Afghanistan, are on the verge of either they will have fully destabilized Pakistan and be on the verge of penetrating the military or taking over the country in some way. And there are nuclear weapons in Pakistan. This, to me, is the threat. The question then is, how do you confront it? If counterterrorism doesn't work because it's too limited, and it loses you your influence with the Pakistani military, and it loses you your control over Afghan territory so you can go after jihadis, what do you do? And here, Obama has to face a terrible set of circumstances, because even if he tries McChrystal's strategy, Afghanistan is much more difficult than Iraq was, and not because it's Vietnam or because it's the graveyard of empires or because the Soviets failed there. The Afghans know we're not the Soviets. The Soviets killed 1 million Afghans. They created millions of refugees. They napalmed the place. People don't confuse us with the Soviets. But what they say, and I've talked to local village councils in full beard and turban, they say, you promised us, but you didn't deliver. I mean, they suspect the Americans. What are you doing here? We thought you were going to give us security. We thought, we'd get jobs. We got nothing. So the U.S. is in the position that if we stay, we do have to do what McChrystal wants to do, which is try to protect the population in certain areas. We can't do it in the whole country. And prove in those areas that we can deliver some goods with the help of Afghan forces, who we have to train more quickly, which has its own problem because many of them are illiterate. They don't have, as the Iraqis had, a ready-made officer corps. We wound up taking most of our Iraqi officers from the previous Iraqi army, which had only collapsed when we went in. In Afghanistan, there hasn't been a national Afghan army since the Soviet times. So it's a much harder job. Each region and district is different with different tribal alignments. Some we can buy. Some, might cross over because they don't like the Taliban, but you have to go group by group, region by region, step by step. Tremendously difficult. I think that the issue of Hamid Karzai, I don't see as so critical. Right now, the president on the talk shows yesterday, and Rahm Emanuel said, we will not deliver more troops until there's a strong government in Afghanistan. Well, forget that. I mean, I think the decision has to be made. Is that mine? Oh. Could be mine. I don't think we can wait on Hamid Karzai, just like we didn't wait on Prime Minister Maliki in Iraq. I think the decision has to be made. And in the end, I think there's one thing that McChrystal said that is very, very vital. He said there's a crisis of confidence among Afghans that undermines our credibility and emboldens the insurgents. A perception that our resolve is uncertain makes Afghans reluctant to align with us against the insurgents. So if we are going to try a counterinsurgency strategy, I think we cannot wait much longer, because when I talk to Pakistanis and to Afghans, the length of this review has convinced people that we're on our way out. Psychologically, the Taliban, it seems to be winning, and people feel like we are leaving, and therefore, at the local level, tribal elders, village leaders, local Taliban commanders are going to be reluctant to break away or turn because they don't want to wind up on the losing side. That said, I sympathize with President Obama's desire to do a thorough review. The problem is that I think we probably understand all the factors, and that we cannot wait on a perfect government in Kabul, because we're not going to get one. And so I think the decision has to be made on whether we think the threat is sufficiently dire, and whether we think the odds of some success in a counterinsurgency policy are sufficiently high, even if they aren't high enough. I don't think the president can afford to wait much longer. Unfortunately, I'm afraid he is going to delay, because this is such a politically fraught decision. And I do believe that the longer we delay, the more difficult it is going to become, if not impossible, to turn this Titanic around. And I'm going to stop there. I already talked too long.